No, the clicker is on.
There it goes. I don't know what I actually did, but at least it works now. I clicked relaunch and it showed up. So I'm not going to talk much about this. The commercial manure application is industry is important. We have a lot of commercial manure application businesses in Iowa. I don't know how many each of you have in your state, so I shouldn't say that. We have roughly 600 businesses. All right, so a fair number. And most of them give me their email address. Not quite all of them, but most of them. Yeah, right? Yeah. They don't all have to supply. Oh, then I feel much better about my life. So when I did this, I think I'm going to tell you there was 562 businesses in Iowa. I got a 20% response rate of that 562 businesses. Of course, 40 of those businesses I had no email address for, and even after I Facebook stalked them, I didn't find it. Yeah, I'm not about Facebook stalking people, right? Like some of them I knew Facebook. So this is just a map of where every business is located. Look, Leslie has a whole bunch of my commercial manure applicators. Maybe not a whole bunch, but a bunch of them are Nebraska commercial manure applicators who aren't afraid to cross the Missouri River. More and more are coming from Minnesota, a couple there from South Dakota, and one lonely fella who comes over from Wisconsin, apparently, right? No one from Illinois, though. A couple from Missouri. So at first I was a little sad that I only got 20% response rate. Still going to live with it. That's actually a sizable number of businesses who responded. And when I show you how much manure that represents in Iowa, you probably won't feel quite as bad about what those numbers actually meant. The first thing I thought, I'm going to ask you what type of manure you haul. That seems like a good basic question, one that I didn't ask the first time that I regretted terribly. So about 2/3 of my businesses haul liquid manure, 20% of them haul solid manure, and God bless the 12% who decided to do both. I don't know if I'd have the guts or monetary investment to put in that type of equipment, but there are some that haul both. If you want to know a little bit more about the ones that haul both, I would say they're mostly liquid manure applicators who are hauling mortality compost for their clientele, right? So a few of them that don't quite follow that pattern, but the majority, that's why they actually got into that business. They're not moving huge amounts of solid manure. All right, so liquid manure application companies. So of those responding, that represents about 2.75 billion gallons of manure. Not a bad number, huh? Yeah, that sounds like a decent number to me. The average company applied about 20 million gallons of manure, and man, the one thing I knew this going in, the industry's hugely different, but every year in training, they don't respect me when I say that. So I was like, I'm going to have some data that shows you how weird you guys all are in coming up with your companies. One person showed up and said, I haul 4 million gallons of manure. That's like 9,600 pigs in Iowa. Like, okay, you haul 2 sites. Good for you, right? And then someone showed up and said, I haul 100 million gallons of manure. And actually, one person showed up and said, I haul 0.5 million gallons of manure. And I'm like, you haul from one 2,400 head building. How are you a commercial manure applicator, right? But whatever, you can be. Huge change in what they're doing. I think one question we all get all the time is, how the heck are you moving manure around? Are you a tank hauler? Are you an umbilical system? At least I was smart enough to ask who's using tanks, who's using umbilicals. About 20% of my respondents said we use umbilicals. 70% said we're tank people. And 10%, again, God bless that group, said we own both, right? Because buying one set of equipment just wasn't enough. We want to be invested in 2. I know some of them, and they own, often the ones who are doing that get a dairy farm, and they're like, oh, umbilical systems are the way to go. And then swine deep pit finishing systems, when you're only trying to put on 2,000 gallons an acre a year, that's a hard hose system to run, right? So that is why we see some of both, and why, if you were wondering my umbilical number so low, deep pit systems in Iowa still tend to like tanks. All right, so of those tank companies, they average about 10 million gallons of manure per company per year. One standard deviation anywhere from 3 to 31 million. Drag companies tend to get bigger, right? They're moving about 60 million gallons a year. They told me they do anywhere from 5 to 231, sort of in that one standard deviation. And people who own both pieces of equipment, thank goodness they are hauling more manure to try and write off all that expensive equipment. They got themselves up to near 100 million gallons of manure a year. So I think that helps me understand sort of the scale, who's doing this for a real job and who's doing it as part-time because I own some equipment and trying to get a neighbor or 2. They both look the same to me when I show up to do training. You're both a commercial manure applicator, but the way they think about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and what they're going to invest in are extremely different. A common question I get in Iowa is, how much of the manure is applied by commercial applicators? The last time I did this was 2014. Back then, you have to do fuzzy math, all right? Lots of fuzzy math. But back then, I came up with about 50% of my manure was hauled by commercial applicators, 50% was hauled by confinement site applicators. So we have 562 of those. If you believe my ratio from the first survey, 431 should be putting on liquid. I come up with commercial applicators should be applying 8 billion gallons of manure in a year. We generate 13 billion gallons of liquid manure in a year, not including rainwater. So if you wanted to have a little fist fight, we could talk about how I should have handled rainwater in here. Luckily, I surveyed them after 2023, and that was a huge drought in Iowa, so rainwater doesn't matter, and I feel decent about my number, right? Like, okay. So that's somewhere in the neighborhood of almost 70% of all our manure is hauled by commercial manure applicators. So we went from, in 10 years, a decade, we went from 50% to 70%. Not a big surprise given the cost of tanks, cost of drag lines, but it's nice to have some data on where we're at. One of the things I've been thinking about was how many application days do we need to get this done? And then I tried to pull out some data from Iowa State that says, hey, there's less application days or fieldwork days in the spring. There's less fieldwork days in the fall. How are we going to get this done in the time that we want to get it done? So I asked the companies two questions. One of them was really good. On a good day, how many? Yeah, I know, right? If you ask two times in two different ways and one of them's good, it works out. And then I also learned that I'm an idiot. So I asked them, one, how much manure do you think you can haul on an average day? And had them just report to me. Good question. I got data I could do something with. I also thought, I'm a smart ag engineer. If I asked them for an equipment inventory, I could figure out what their capacity could be if they're not working very hard. Yeah. Some of them were really good answers, and some of them were like, I bought a hose that's 2 inches bigger than my last one. I'm like, that tells me absolutely nothing. I don't know what to do with that, right? So at least one of them was good. I told you we had about 13 billion gallons of manure. I say we need about 50 working days to apply all the manure in Iowa. I asked them not to apply until the beginning of November and be done before the soil freezes. That's about 45 days in Iowa, and I need 50. So that's not taking downtime between sites. That's not moving equipment around. I'm a little tight, right? But it helps us understand where we're at for capacity and what we're trying to ask them to do. This year, I did ask my three different groups at training, when are you putting manure on? And I tried to group it. Early fall to me was anything from basically harvest till November 1, right? So each group told me how much manure they thought they were putting on roughly in early fall, late fall, which I defined until the ground froze, and then winter application of liquid manure is actually banned in Iowa. But if you're a confinement site applicator, you could put on solid manure. If you're a commercial applicator, well, I encourage them to attend the solid manure training. Some of them don't show up and help you understand what they actually do, and then they can write on your evaluation, I wanted to see solid manure, not liquid. Well, they watched the liquid and filled out the liquid evaluation, all right? So, but that gives you a rough distribution of where we're putting manure on. I told you I would try and tell a happy story on my first one on spills. Looks to me like 80% of the manure in Iowa goes on in the fall, and even worse than that, 25% of all my manure goes on before November 1st. So that might be hard to stick around for a while, but still useful data to understand. If I want to feel a little bit better about this, I asked them the same survey question on 2015, and I got some long answers on the back of my survey that told me any time of the year I'm putting manure on is in season for me. In season means it's time to put manure on. And I thought there was some colorful language with that, not just that, right? So we're making a little progress there. At least they answered the question in the way I was hoping to see it answered, and I didn't get anyone who wrote me a mean note this year. So huge stride. All right, solid manure companies. So the average company put on 1.1 million tons. No, a total of 1.1 million tons of solid manure was applied by commercial applicator. The average business did about 10,000 tons per year. Huge range in business size, anywhere from 1,200 tons all the way up to one business doing 76,000 tons. Right, so a pretty big range in who's out there. Again, that wasn't a surprise. We have one solid manure company who I estimate handles something like 65% of all our poultry litter. So I knew that we were going to see an answer that sort of skewed like that. That company has been starting to handle less of our poultry litter, and it's getting more diversified again because it's hard to manage that many employees. They have 310 employees. So, all right, the average business did about 15,000 tons of manure. All right, so again, some fuzzy math, me making some guesses. Iowa has about 6 million tons of solid manure, give or take. My survey captured about 18% of that, and I thought, oh, that's not so bad. I can live with that number. 20% of the manure in Iowa represented. There were 200 businesses applying solid manure, and that gives me something like 3.6 million tons of the solid out of the 6 million tons of solid manure are handled by commercial manure applicators. So that's about 60% or so. My first survey, I did not ask intelligent enough questions to even get at attempting to answer that number, so I can't compare how it was a decade ago. But definitely trending higher. The truth is, there's probably a lot of poultry manure and a lot less beef cattle manure. So I did the same sort of math. How much can we get done in a day? How many days do we need to get it done? I came up with They needed 57 working days. So just a little bit more than what I had for my liquid manure. Of course, we don't say no putting manure on in the winter, so they can do it all winter long. So not a surprise that they still put a lot of manure on in the winter, for better or worse. And because of that, they probably haven't had to buy as much equipment to get it done in a shorter period of time. If you want to say I'm a bad survey writer, one thing I wish I would have done is sort of differentiated, are you just hauling manure to a field and stockpiling it, or are you applying it? Wasn't smart enough to think about that question before I did it, and regretted it every day since. Okay. The fun one, how much are you charging to put manure on? I get this question pretty much every week, every time I run into a commercial manure applicator, every time I run into a confinement site applicator of like, what does this really cost if I wanted to quit buying this expensive equipment? So here's my liquid graph. I didn't want to be in Leslie's picture, but she's done, so now I can stand next to my figure. So I asked, since I knew if they applied with tanks or umbilicals, I could separate them out. Basically, if you're using a tank, you were charging 1.9 cents a gallon, and it didn't matter if I asked you to put on 4,000 gallons an acre or 20,000 gallons an acre, the price they were charging didn't change. I did, if you're saying, like, why are there only 3 points on that? It's because I asked them those 3 points. I said, what would you charge if I was putting on 4,000 gallons an acre? What would you charge if I was putting on 10,000 gallons an acre? And what would you charge if I was putting on 20,000? And those are roughly what we put on for deep pit swine finishing manure, gestation fairing manure, and dairy manure. Now, I probably should put on like 2,000 gallons an acre with dairy manure, and I get the same problem. Melissa left, but we talked about this earlier. People say, I can't put on 2,000 gallons an acre. So I was nice to them and said, what did you charge for four? And then later I had a specific question of what do you charge for low rate application? Solid manure, I did the same thing. So I said, what happens when you're putting on 2 tons an acre, poultry litter manure, 5 tons an acre, nope, 6 tons an acre, turkey litter, or 15 tons an acre? Separated dairy solids or bed pack, right? So you can sort of see what the curves look like and what they said they were charging. Drag lines, it did get cheaper as I put on manure, higher manure application rates. So those dairies often use drag lines, tends to make sense. I did ask how much you're charging to move manure around. That's not a response question. That's something that they get a free write in. So if you want fun, make sense of what they wrote in, but at least they do write long books for me on what their charging model is. And then I squint at it and turn it into a nice little number that's easy to understand. So if it was liquid manure, they were charging about 4/10 of a penny a mile a gallon beyond the first mile. If it's solid manure, they're charging about 40 cents a ton for every mile beyond the first mile. I asked them how far they were charged moving manure. Solid manure in Iowa moves something like 15 miles with a standard deviation of 15 miles. Beef cattle manure probably doesn't move at all. Poultry manure moves a long ways, right? So I should have asked them to separate that out, but I'm an idiot sometimes, right? Like I don't know what I'm going to get. Liquid manure moved on average something like 2 miles, plus or minus a mile. And then I asked them what your primary concerns are. Like in the next 10 years, what's going to be the biggest concern for your business? They all said that equipment costs too much. I was actually surprised by this. I thought they'd tell me labor was the big problem. And then they said the things that I wanted to hear, application capacity, biosecurity, things of that nature that sort of impede their ability to work ahead. But I think it gives me future programming directions to think about how to talk to these individuals, especially the business managers, talking about how does pricing, machinery costs, and me asking you to stop applying manure before November 1 all interact, right? So lots of fun, hopefully decent information. There's some of the things they said at my carousel of equipment this year about how we were going to handle some of these problems.